Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. Your job is simple. Listen. Let the language wash over you. You don't need to understand every word. Just stay with the conversation, follow the ideas, and let your English do what it's designed to do: absorb. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
If you take a second, just to really look at the human body, you start noticing some incredibly weird design choices.
Oh, absolutely. Like really bizarre structural stuff.
Right. I mean, take the human eye. We always think of it as this marvel of optical engineering, right?
Yeah, the ultimate biological camera.
Exactly. But the optic nerve actually punches right through the retina.
Which creates a literal blind spot, like right near the center of your vision. It is terrible design.
It really is. And then you look at the fact that we have an appendix that can just, spontaneously rupture for no reason.
Or our lower back.
Oh my gosh, yes, the human lower back.
It is essentially a modified horizontal bridge, right? But it is forced to support a vertical pillar.
Which explains why literally almost everyone listening to this will get back pain eventually.
Yeah, it is a structural nightmare. Because when you look at a smartphone or a skyscraper, you know there is a blueprint.
Right, every piece is there for a reason because an engineer planned it out.
Exactly. But when you look at biology, that idea of a master blueprint completely falls apart.
We are looking at a system that is mind-bogglingly intricate, but clearly wasn't planned out in advance.
And that is the ultimate paradox we face in biology. We observe what appears to be incredibly complex, purposeful design.
Like wings meant for flying or hearts meant for pumping.
Right. But there is no designer sitting at a drafting table. There is no foresight at all.
Just trial and error.
Yes. There is only a blind process of trial and error operating over unimaginable stretches of time.
And unpacking that paradox is our entire mission for this deep dive. Welcome in, everyone.
I'm glad to be here.
Today, we have a massive stack of research, historical documents, and biological data to go through. And our goal is to trace what I would argue is, well, the most consequential scientific idea ever conceived.
Evolution by natural selection.
Exactly. We are going to take this single idea, starting from its explosive publication in 1859, and follow it all the way to how it completely explains the behaviors you are engaging in right now.
It really does touch everything.
It does. We are going to explore how this biological framework influences who you find attractive, why you are compelled to cooperate with your neighbors, and even the literal physical reasons why you might struggle to learn a new language as an adult.
The sheer scope of this framework is what makes it so compelling.
Right.
But before we get into the mechanisms of how any of this actually works, we need to draw a very hard line between public perception and scientific reality.
Oh, this is so important. Let's get into this.
Because in public discourse, particularly in places like the United States, where there's often religious pushback, evolution is sometimes framed as a controversial topic.
Like it is up for debate.
Right. But inside the scientific community, there is zero controversy about whether evolution occurred. It is a foundational fact.
And I want to jump in here and clarify the language, actually, because I think a lot of the public confusion comes from the phrase, the theory of evolution.
Oh, the semantic trap of the word theory.
Yes, because people hear the word theory and they equate it to, like, a detective in a movie saying, oh, I have a theory about who committed the murder.
Right. They think it means a really good guess or a hunch.
Exactly. But that is not what it means in science, right?
Not at all. In the technical language of science, a theory is the absolute highest level of understanding we can possibly achieve.
So it is not a guess.
No. It is a comprehensively organized framework that explains a massive set of facts, and it allows us to make testable predictions.
Like gravity is a theory?
Exactly. Germs causing disease is a theory, and evolution is arguably the most robust, cross-examined theory in the history of science.
And our confidence doesn't just come from looking at a few old dinosaur bones, right?
No, it comes from an overwhelming convergence of entirely independent fields of study.
So it's not just paleontologists digging in the dirt. It's geneticists and labs, too.
Far beyond that. I mean, we have the fossil record showing transitional forms, sure, but we also have comparative anatomy showing homologous structures.
Wait, what does homologous mean in this context?
It means they share an evolutionary origin. So, like the fact that the bones in a human hand, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing are functionally variations of the exact same skeletal structure.
Oh, wow. So they look different on the outside, but the blueprint is the same.
Exactly. And we have biogeography, observing how species are distributed across continents and islands. We have developmental biology, showing how embryos develop.
And now we have DNA, right?
Yes, we have the crushing weight of molecular genetics. Plus, we literally observe evolution happening in real time.
Like with bacteria.
Right. We see bacteria evolving resistance to antibiotics in a matter of days.
It's like having 10 witnesses to a bank robbery who don't know each other. We're all standing on different corners, and yet every single detail of their testimony lines up perfectly.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. No single fossil or genetic sequence is the entire case. The case is the convergence.
The overwhelming alignment of all the data.
Exactly. So the genuine debates happening in scientific journals today are never about whether evolution happened.
The debates are about how it happened.
Entirely about the granular mechanisms. Scientists are arguing over the mathematical weight of natural selection versus genetic drift, or how different ecological pressures interact.
But the fact of common descent and the reality of natural selection?
That is the settled baseline. Zero debate.
Okay, so with that baseline established, let's jump into the core of what Charles Darwin actually figured out. Because the mechanism he proposed is just staggering in its simplicity.
It really is elegant.
He realized that if you have just 3 ingredients, complex life is inevitable.
Right, just 3.
You need variation, meaning not everyone is exactly the same. You need heritability, meaning traits can be passed down to offspring. And you need differential reproductive success.
Meaning some of those traits help you survive and reproduce better than others.
Right, so how do those 3 things interact?
Well, those 3 ingredients create a logical inevitability. If an organism has a trait that gives it a slight edge in finding food or avoiding predators in its specific environment, it will likely live longer.
And if it lives longer, it has more offspring.
Exactly. And those offspring inherit that advantageous trait.
Because heritability.
Right. And then, over thousands of generations, the frequency of that trait increases until it basically becomes the norm for the entire population.
I always picture natural selection as a blind, incredibly stubborn sculptor.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, imagine a sculptor working with this massive block of clay, but they are blindfolded and have no concept of what a statue even is.
They're just swinging a hammer.
Exactly. They're just randomly swinging a hammer and slapping on clumps of clay. But there is one unbreakable rule.
Shiz.
Every time a piece of clay makes the structure slightly less stable in the wind, it gets removed. Every time a piece makes it slightly better at catching rain for stability, it stays.
So the sculptor isn't planning a masterpiece at all.
Not at all. But over millions of years of just keeping what works and discarding what doesn't, this mindless process accidentally carves out an architectural marvel.
And historically, that lack of a conscious planner was the most difficult pill for society to swallow.
I mean, it still is for many people.
Definitely. You go back to philosophers like William Paley and his famous divine watchmaker argument.
Oh, right. Walk us through Paley's argument.
So Paley argued that if you are walking through a field and you find a pocket watch on the ground, you know instantly that it didn't assemble itself by wind and rain.
Right, because of the intricate gears, the glass, the springs.
Exactly. Complexity demands a conscious designer. Paley then pointed to the human eye and said, well, this is vastly more complex than a watch. Therefore, biology requires a designer.
Which is a very intuitive leap, honestly, because how could a blind sculptor randomly slap together a retina, a lens, and a cornea all at once?
Right.
If any of those pieces are missing, the eye doesn't work. So what good is half an eye?
And that question, what good is half an eye, is the classic misunderstanding of how the sculptor works.
Because evolution doesn't assemble complex organs from scratch in one generation, right?
No, not at all. The eye didn't just pop into existence fully formed. It evolved through incredibly tiny, incremental steps over hundreds of millions of years.
And here is the crucial part.
Every single intermediate step offered a slight survival advantage.
So walk us through that. How do we actually get from no eye to a human eye?
You start with just a really simple flat patch of light-sensitive cells, just on the skin of some primitive organism.
Okay, so just a flat patch.
Right.
Yeah.
It cannot see shapes at all, but it can basically tell day from night.
Or maybe it detects, like, the shadow of a predator passing overhead?
Exactly. And compared to an organism that is completely blind, that is a massive survival advantage.
Wow, yeah. So the blind sculptor keeps the light patch.
Yes. And then, over huge amounts of time, random variations cause that flat patch to curve inward, just slightly.
Forming like a little cup shape.
Precisely. And this is better because the curvature allows the organism to sense the direction the light is coming from.
Oh, because only part of the cup gets eliminated.
Right. So again, that is another slight reproductive advantage.
It is just tiny steps.
And over more millions of years, the opening of that cup narrows.
Which creates a pinhole camera effect, right?
Exactly, which allows for rudimentary image focus.
Oy.
And eventually, transparent cells over the opening thicken to form a lens, vastly improving resolution.
Every step is just slightly better than the last. You don't need a designer. You just need enough time and a relentless filter for what works.
The complexity is undeniable, but the inference that someone drafted it is simply unnecessary once you understand the cumulative power of selection.
And Darwin didn't stop there. He took a second massive swing with the concept of common descent.
Yes, the idea that if you go back far enough, every single living thing on this planet shares a common ancestor.
And this is where the receipts get wild. Darwin proposed this based on bones and basic observation, but he couldn't see the molecular code.
No, he was completely blind to DNA.
But today, we can see it.
And modern genetics has validated his hypothesis with mathematical precision. We can now read the genetic code of different species and measure the exact sequence similarities.
And the degree of similarity maps perfectly onto the evolutionary distance between them.
It does.
Our research notes on this are just astounding. For you listening right now, consider your own physical body. If we sequence your DNA, you share roughly 99% of your protein-coding genes with a chimpanzee.
Which we expected.
Right, that makes sense. But you also share about 85% with a mouse.
Yeah.
You share 40% with a fruit fly. And here's the kicker. You share about 15% of your genetic code with baking yeast.
It is incredible.
The yeast making bread rise in your kitchen shares a distant ancient ancestor with you.
It forces a profound cognitive shift regarding our place in the natural world. From a purely methodological standpoint, the most compelling aspect of this is how the independent fields align.
What do you mean?
Well, biologists can construct a tree of life using nothing but these genetic mutation rates, completely ignoring the fossil record.
Okay.
Then, paleontologists can construct a separate tree of life using nothing but fossils in the ground, completely ignoring genetics.
And what happens when you compare them?
When we lay those two independent trees over each other, they match. The dating aligns perfectly.
It is the ultimate vindication.
Truly.
But as brilliant as Darwin was, he had some massive blind spots. Because the entire engine of natural selection relies on traits being passed down from parent to child.
Right. If you have a better beak, you have to be able to give that beak to your offspring.
But Darwin had absolutely no idea how heredity actually worked, did he?
It was the glaring, gaping hole in his entire framework. I mean, it was a total black box to him. He observed heritability, obviously, but the biological mechanism was a mystery.
And without a mechanism, his critics had a very valid point.
Because if you do not know how traits are passed down, the prevailing logic back then was blending inheritance.
Right.
Right.
The idea that a child is basically just a smooth mixture of their parents. Like mixing paint.
Which is a fatal problem for natural selection. It completely destroys the mechanism.
Walk us through why that destroys it. Think about the paint analogy.
Well, if you have a population of, say, white organisms, and one random mutation creates a black organism that has a huge survival advantage.
Okay, so the black one is surviving better.
Right. But under blending inheritance, when that black organism mates with a white one, the offspring are gray.
I see.
And then those gray offspring mate with white ones, and they become lighter gray.
So within a few generations, that advantageous dark trait is completely diluted.
It is washed out entirely. Natural selection cannot build on a trait if it constantly diffuses into the population like that.
So how did Darwin try to fix this? I know he came up with a hypothesis, and to be blunt, it was a complete disaster.
Oh, it was. He proposed a concept called pangenesis.
Pangenesis.
Yes. He hypothesized that every single tissue in the body, your skin, your liver, your muscles, secreted tiny invisible particles he called gemmules.
Gemmules?
Gemmules. And he thought these gemmules circulated through the bloodstream and magically aggregated in the reproductive organs to be passed on.
So he thought if you worked out a lot and got huge muscles, your muscle gemmules would get stronger and you'd pass on big muscles to your kid.
Basically, yes.
Which we know is completely false.
It was fundamentally flawed. It bordered on Lamarckism. the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
Hmm.
Even his closest allies at the time politely suggested he abandon the idea.
But the irony here is almost painful, because right at the exact same time Darwin is tearing his hair out over magic gemmules, the actual answer is being discovered by a monk in a garden.
Gregor Mendel.
Gregor Mendel.
Mendel's story is the great tragic missed connection in the history of science.
Let's unpack what Mendel actually figured out, because he solved the blending paint problem. Mendel was breeding thousands of pea plants.
Right.
And he noticed that if he crossed a plant with yellow peas and a plant with green peas, he didn't get yellowish green peas. He got distinct whole colors.
Mendel discovered that inheritance isn't a liquid that blends. It is based on discrete, indivisible units.
What we now call genes.
Exactly. He realized that an organism carries 2 copies of each unit, one from each parent. And crucially, he figured out that these units do not mix.
They maintain their integrity across generations.
Right. Sometimes one trait is dominant and masks the other, like the yellow pea masking the green. But the underlying genetic unit for green is still there, intact.
Just waiting to be passed on to the next generation.
Yes. It is the mathematical foundation that natural selection desperately needed.
Traits don't get washed out. They get shuffled like a deck of cards. The black card stays black no matter how many times you shuffle the deck.
Exactly. And Mendel publishes this brilliantly elegant math in 1866.
And absolutely no one cares.
The scientific community completely ignored it. Darwin died in 1882, having never read it. It took until 1900 for biologists to rediscover Mendel's work and realize what they were holding.
Wow. So it wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that science finally forced Darwin and Mendel to hold hands.
Yes, this era is known as the modern synthesis.
Instead of reading off a list of names, let's explain what the synthesis actually did.
Well, they took Darwin's broad, sweeping idea of populations changing over time, and they anchored it to Mendel's rigid, microscopic math of genetic variation.
So it gave evolution mathematical rigor.
Exactly. The modern synthesis established that evolution is fundamentally a change in the frequency of alleles, which are gene variants within a population over generations.
And natural selection is the force that shifts those frequencies.
Right. And it set the stage for 1953, when Watson, Crick, and Franklin unveiled the physical double helix structure of DNA.
Finally, we had the molecule, we had the blueprint.
But the story didn't freeze in 1953. We've uncovered layers of biological weirdness since then that make the modern synthesis look a bit simplistic.
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about EVO-DEVO, which stands for Evolutionary Developmental Biology.
A fascinating field.
Because for a long time, we thought evolution was just about mutating the genes that build proteins, right?
We assumed that to get a wildly different physical body, you needed wildly different genes.
But EVO-DEVO revealed something different.
It showed that the genetic toolkit used to build a fruit fly is remarkably similar to the genetic toolkit used to build a human.
Which sounds impossible.
It does. But the vast morphological differences between us aren't just about having different structural genes. They are heavily driven by regulatory genes.
Regulatory genes, I like to think of it like a construction site.
Okay, walk me through that.
The structural genes are the bricks, the wood, and the glass. The regulatory genes are the foreman with the clipboard who decides when the bricks are laid and how long the carpenters work.
That is a great way to put it.
Because you can hand 2 identical piles of bricks and wood to 2 different construction crews. If one foreman says, build upwards for 3 months, and the other says, build outwards for 1 month, you end up with 2 completely different buildings using the exact same materials.
That is highly accurate.
Yeah.
A small mutation in a regulatory gene might keep the cellular growth of a skull going for an extra week during embryonic development.
And that tiny shift in timing creates a massively different skull shape in the adult animal.
Exactly. Evolution is often just tinkering with the timing and spatial expression of existing genetic tools, rather than inventing new tools from scratch.
And then there is epigenetics, which literally sounds like science fiction.
It really does.
Because we used to think your DNA sequence was your ultimate, unchangeable destiny.
But epigenetics introduced a whole new layer of control over the genome.
What exactly is it doing?
It refers to chemical modifications, like methyl groups attaching to the DNA molecule, or changes to the histones that DNA wraps around.
But they don't change the actual code, right?
Correct. They don't change the underlying ACTG sequence. But they act like volume knobs. They can turn specific genes up, down, or entirely off.
And the astonishing part is that some of these epigenetic tags, which can be influenced by environmental factors like stress or diet, can actually be passed down to the next generation.
Yes. So a parent's environment can temporarily alter how their child's genes are read without changing the genetic code itself.
That is wild.
It adds a layer of plasticity to heredity
Yeah.
that the architects of the modern synthesis just didn't anticipate.
And if you want another layer of complexity, look at microbes. Because bacteria don't wait for generations to pass traits down.
No, they engage in horizontal gene transfer.
They can literally bump into another entirely different species of bacteria and swap packets of DNA like trading cards.
Which completely breaks the idea of a neat, branching family tree. It's more like a tangled web.
Okay, so with all these intricate mechanisms, regulatory genes, epigenetics, natural selection, I want to play devil's advocate for a minute.
Go for it.
Because once you understand the sheer power of natural selection, it becomes a very seductive hammer. Suddenly, everything looks like a nail.
Yes.
There is a temptation to look at every single physical trait on an animal or a human and invent a brilliant survival story for it.
You're identifying the adaptationist program, which became a major philosophical battleground in biology.
Right, because not everything is a survival tool.
It's exactly. In 1979, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin published a famously scathing critique of this mindset in a paper titled The Spandrels of San Marco.
Let's break down that architectural analogy because it completely changes how you look at the body.
So San Marco is a stunning cathedral in Venice. Its ceiling features a massive circular dome supported by 4 rounded arches.
Okay, a dome on arches.
Now, geometrically, if you put a round dome on top of rounded arches, you inevitably create these leftover, roughly triangular spaces in the 4 corners where the arches meet.
And in architecture, those spaces are called spandrels.
Right. And in San Marco, those spandrels are covered in gorgeous, elaborate mosaics of angels and saints.
So Gould and Lewontin argued that if a naive observer walked into that cathedral, they might look at those beautiful mosaics and think, wow, the architect must have purposefully designed those triangular spaces specifically because they wanted a place to put those mosaics.
But they had the causality completely backward.
The architect didn't design the space for the art.
No, the space is an unavoidable structural byproduct of putting a dome on arches. It's an accident of geometry. The artist just came in later and painted on the leftover space.
And Gould and Lewontin applied this directly to evolutionary biology.
They accused their colleagues of creating just-so stories. A biologist might look at a physical trait and invent a clever story about how it evolved to solve a specific survival problem.
Without considering that the trait might just be a biological spandrel.
Exactly. A structural byproduct of some other evolutionary change.
Give us an example of a biological spandrel.
A classic example often debated is the human chin.
The chin.
Yes. We are the only primates with a pronounced bony chin. And for a long time, researchers tried to invent adaptationist stories. Maybe the chin evolved to help us chew harder food. Or maybe it helps absorb the mechanical stress of speech.
But what is the alternative?
A growing consensus suggests the chin might just be a spandrel. As hominids evolved, our faces flattened and our jaws shrank relative to our ancestors. The lower jawbone just happens to recede at a different angle than the dental arcade above it, leaving that bony protrusion at the bottom.
So the chin wasn't selected for, it is just the architectural leftover of a shrinking face.
Precisely.
Another one I love is the redness of blood.
Yeah.
Blood isn't red because the color red gives us a survival advantage.
Right. It doesn't help us hide or hunt.
It's red because we need hemoglobin to carry oxygen, and hemoglobin relies on iron, and when iron binds with oxygen, it happens to reflect red light.
The redness is just the physics of the universe along for the ride.
Exactly. So Gould and Lewontin really forced the field to recognize that not every bump, color, or behavior is a perfectly tuned survival machine. Evolution is constrained by history, chemistry, and geometry.
Methodological rigor is crucial.
Okay, so if we accept that not everything is about surviving longer, what about traits that seem actively suicidal?
Yes.
Because Darwin noticed that some animals possess features that make absolutely zero sense from a survival standpoint.
He did, and it bothered him immensely. He famously wrote to an evolutionary colleague that the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail made him physically sick.
Because it breaks his own rule.
Completely.
If natural selection is about the blind sculptor cutting away anything that makes you vulnerable, a peacock's tail is a disaster.
It is heavy. It requires a massive amount of metabolic energy to grow.
And practically speaking, it is a giant iridescent neon sign pointing directly at the bird, telling every tiger and wild dog in the jungle, "Here I am, please eat me."
From the perspective of pure survival, it is a catastrophic handicap.
So how did Darwin solve this?
This forced Darwin to articulate a second, equally powerful mechanism in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man. He introduced the concept of sexual selection.
Sexual selection.
Yes. Evolution is not just a game of survival. It is a game of reproductive success. You could live to be 100 years old, but if you don't reproduce, your evolutionary fitness is zero.
And Darwin divided sexual selection into two arenas.
Yes. The first is intersexual selection. That is competition within the same sex.
So think of two massive elk-locking antlers fighting for dominance and control of a harem.
Exactly. The larger antlers didn't evolve to fight off wolves. They evolved to fight other elk.
And the second type.
The second type is intersexual selection, where one sex exerts pressure on the other through mate choice. This is the peacock.
The peahen, the female, is the one making the choice.
Precisely. For reasons we can explore, the females developed a neurological preference for large, symmetrical, brightly colored displays.
So the males with the best tails get to mate.
Yes. And the males with small, practical camouflage tails survive longer, but they die alone without passing on their practical genes.
The pressure of female choice is so overwhelmingly strong that it drags the male's physical form away from optimal survival and toward elaborate display.
It really does.
It's like biology's version of a luxury tax. Only the absolute healthiest, most genetically robust male can afford to waste that much energy growing a useless, heavy tail and still manage to outrun a predator.
The tail is an honest signal of genetic quality.
An honest signal.
Yes. That is known as the handicap principle, formulated much later by Ahmad Zahavi. But the core insight remains. Mating success can drive evolution just as powerfully and sometimes more bizarrely than sheer survival.
Which naturally pivots us to humans, because if you are listening to this and thinking, well, I don't have a giant tail, this mechanism is still actively running your life.
Oh, absolutely.
This brings us to the field of evolutionary psychology, which attempts to look at human dating, mating, and social behavior through this exact same Darwinian lens.
It is a deeply fascinating discipline. But as we navigate it, we have to proceed with extreme caution.
Let's get into what the researchers actually found. Like David Buss, who conducted these massive cross-cultural surveys spanning dozens of countries.
Right. They wanted to identify universal patterns in human mate preferences.
To see if the pressures of human evolutionary history left a permanent psychological architecture regarding what we find attractive.
And what the data revealed were statistically significant, consistent sex differences across diverse cultures.
Okay, what were the patterns? Because I know this gets touchy.
Generally speaking, women placed a higher premium on cues related to resource acquisition, social status, and ambition.
And men?
Men, conversely, placed a relatively higher premium on cues of youth and physical attractiveness, which, in evolutionary terms, correlate with fertility and reproductive value.
Now, I can immediately see the evolutionary logic here. It comes down to basic biology and the asymmetry of reproduction.
Let's unpack that asymmetry.
For a male, the biological cost of reproduction is relatively trivial, a few minutes of time and cheap genetic material.
Right.
But for a female, the baseline biological investment is immense. 9 months of internal gestation, significant metabolic drain, the physical risks of childbirth, and years of lactation and child rearing.
You are describing Robert Triver's theory of parental investment. The sex that invests more heavily in the offspring, in humans, overwhelmingly the female, must be the choosier sex.
Because a poor mating choice is vastly more costly.
It's exactly. A poor mating choice for a female ancestor in the Pleistocene era could mean starvation or death for her offspring. Therefore, evolutionary psychology argues that females evolved psychological mechanisms that favor mates who signal the ability and willingness to invest resources and protection.
While males, limited primarily by access to fertile partners, evolved to value cues of fertility.
That is the evolutionary argument, yes.
That makes logical sense on paper. But I am waving a massive yellow caution flag here.
As you should.
Because earlier we talked about Gould and Lewontin warning us against just-so stories. Isn't evolutionary psychology incredibly vulnerable to this?
It is the single biggest methodological critique of the field.
Because you could just look at modern dating behavior, see a pattern, and then invent a convenient caveman story to justify it.
Let's take the preference for resources as an example. An evolutionary psychologist sees a woman in New York prioritizing a partner's earning potential and attributes it to hardwired Pleistocene brain architecture.
But an anthropologist or sociologist would counter with a completely different explanation.
Exactly. They would ask, what if this preference has nothing to do with biological evolution? What if, for the last 10,000 years of patriarchal agricultural societies, women have been systematically denied legal rights, property ownership, and access to their own economic resources?
Right. If you are legally barred from making your own money, of course you're going to prioritize marrying someone who has money.
It's a rational economic strategy based on culture, not a genetic mandate from a million years ago.
That is the core tension. It is immensely difficult to parse out what is an evolved psychological adaptation and what is a rational response to current cultural and economic constraints.
Furthermore, the ancestral environment, the African savanna where these traits supposedly evolved, is often underspecified.
We don't have a time machine to observe exactly what early hominid social structures were like.
We extrapolate from modern hunter-gatherer societies, but that is an imperfect mirror.
So we have to be incredibly careful not to fall into the trap of biological determinism. Just because a behavior has an evolutionary root doesn't mean it is morally right, and it doesn't mean it can't be culturally overridden.
That is the naturalistic fallacy, assuming that what is natural is good. Science describes what is, not what ought to be. Human psychology undeniably has an evolutionary history, but we must demand rigorous evidence before declaring any specific modern behavior a hardwired adaptation.
Right, we are just looking at the data from both sides here. Okay, so we've talked about surviving and we've talked about mating.
To the core drives.
Fundamentally, at the genetic level, both of those drives are aggressively selfish. It is about my survival and passing on my genes.
Yes.
So we hit a massive brick wall. How does this selfish genetic engine produce kindness?
The puzzle of altruism.
How does evolution explain a soldier jumping on a grenade to save his squad, or a bird letting out a warning call that alerts the flock but draws the hawk directly to itself?
The problem of altruism behavior that reduces the actor's own fitness while increasing the fitness of others was the single greatest theoretical threat to Darwin's entire framework.
Because by the strict logic of natural selection, a gene that causes you to sacrifice your life for someone else should be violently scrubbed from the gene pool in a single generation.
The selfish genes should inherit the earth.
But they don't. We see cooperation everywhere in nature, so who solved this math problem?
The breakthrough didn't arrive until 1964, courtesy of an evolutionary biologist named William Hamilton. He formalized a concept known as kin selection.
Kin selection. Let's break that down.
Hamilton recognized that natural selection doesn't care about you, the individual organism. It cares about the genetic information. And your genetic information isn't confined to your own body.
Because your relatives share your genes.
Exactly. You share roughly 50% of your genes with your siblings, 25% with your nieces and nephews, and 12.5% with your first cousins.
So Hamilton realized that an altruistic gene can spread through a population if the sacrifice of the individual helps save enough copies of that same gene residing in the bodies of relatives.
Yes. There's a famous quote from the geneticist J.B.S. Haldane that perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, I know this one. Someone asked him in a pub if he would give his life to save his drowning brother.
And he supposedly did some quick mental math and said, "No, but I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins."
It sounds incredibly cold, but it perfectly summarizes what we call Hamilton's rule.
The rule dictates that an altruistic behavior will be favored by evolution if the cost to the actor is less than the benefit to the recipient, multiplied by the degree of genetic relatedness.
It shifted the entire paradigm from individual fitness to inclusive fitness.
Right. Your evolutionary success is measured not just by your children, but by the aggregate success of your entire genetic network.
Which explains why bees and ants have such incredibly coordinated, self-sacrificing societies. They are all sisters. The genetic math strongly favors them acting as a single superorganism.
Exactly.
But humans aren't ants. I am not genetically related to my neighbor, but if their house is on fire, I'm still going to help them. Kin selection can't explain that.
It cannot. For cooperation among non-relatives, we had to wait until 1971 for Robert Trivers to introduce the theory of reciprocal altruism.
Reciprocal altruism.
Trivers demonstrated that evolution can favor costly cooperation between strangers, provided there's a high probability that the favor will be returned in the future.
The classic, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine.
But for this to work biologically, the organisms must possess several specific traits.
Like what?
They must have a lifespan long enough to interact repeatedly. They must have the cognitive capacity to recognize individuals. And crucially, They must have the memory to track who has cooperated and who has cheated them in the past.
Because if a population is full of blind cooperators, a selfish cheater will come in, take all the free back scratches, give nothing in return, and out-reproduce everyone.
Exactly. Reciprocal altruism requires a cheater detection mechanism. This repeated game logic forms the biological bedrock of human society.
Game theorists study this using the prisoner's dilemma, right?
Yes, showing that in repeated interactions, a strategy of conditional cooperation, like tit for tat, mathematically outcompetes pure selfishness.
Emotionally, evolutionary psychologists argue that human feelings of gratitude, guilt, and moral outrage are actually the psychological software that evolved to manage these reciprocal contracts.
We feel gratitude to encourage future cooperation, and we feel outrage to punish cheaters.
That is fascinating. But some scientists think even this isn't enough to explain humans, right? Because we build global supply chains and fight in armies of millions, we cooperate on a scale that defies simple one-on-one reciprocation.
This leads to one of the most intense ongoing debates in evolutionary biology, the concept of multi-level selection or group selection.
What does that mean, group selection?
Figures like E.O. Wilson have argued that while selfish individuals might outcompete altruistic individuals within a specific group, a group composed of highly cooperative altruists will absolutely crush a group composed of selfish individuals.
Therefore, selection can operate at the level of the entire group.
Exactly. This debate between kin selection purists and multi-level selection advocates remains deeply contested, but it highlights the unique puzzle of human hyper-cooperation.
Which brings us perfectly to the concept of the human exception. Because yes, wolves hunt in packs, and chimpanzees have complex politics. But human societies are categorically different.
We didn't just survive, we completely dominated the planet.
We split the atom. What makes us the exception? If we are running on the same Darwinian software, why are we the only ones building skyscrapers?
That is the ultimate question of anthropology. What is the cognitive Rubicon we crossed? Many researchers, notably Michael Tomasello at the Max Planck Institute, argue that the key distinguishing feature is our capacity for cumulative culture.
Let us focus on Tomasello's concept of the ratchet effect. Because I think this is like the most powerful mental model in our entire discussion today.
It is brilliant. So think of a physical ratchet tool, like a socket wrench.
Okay, a socket wrench.
It allows a gear to turn forward, right? But a mechanism clicks into place to prevent it from slipping backward.
Right, you hear that clicking sound.
Exactly. And Tomasello argues that human culture operates precisely like that ratchet.
So we don't slip backward.
Right. Other animals do possess culture. I mean, chimpanzees learn to use sticks to fish for termites.
And they pass that behavior down to their kids.
They do. But it never improves. A chimpanzee stick today looks exactly like a chimpanzee stick a million years ago.
Oh, wow. They learn, but they do not accumulate.
Exactly. They lack the ratchet. Humans, on the other hand, invent a tool, use it, and then the next generation doesn't just copy it. They modify it. They improve it.
They lock in that new knowledge and build upon it.
Yeah.
We go from a stone hand axe to a copper blade to a steel sword to a guided missile.
And Tomasello argues this happens because of a uniquely human cognitive trait called shared intentionality.
Shared intentionality.
Yes. We are biologically predisposed to understand that other humans have minds, goals, and intentions. We have a profound instinctual drive to align our minds with others to achieve a shared goal.
Unlike apes, humans actively and intentionally teach each other. We point at things to share attention.
This cognitive architecture allows knowledge to accumulate across generations, completely decoupling our technological progress from the slow pace of genetic mutation.
Which totally reframes the old, exhausted debate about nature versus nurture. We always hear people arguing whether a behavior is hardwired by genetics or learned from the environment.
But evolution shows us that it's a false dichotomy. Biology provides the hardware, but culture writes the software.
A perfect illustration of this interaction is the human fear of snakes. For decades, psychologists debated if this fear was innate or learned.
The evolutionary perspective resolves it through the concept of preparedness.
Preparedness, meaning we are built ready to learn it.
Precisely. Human infants, long before they have any concept of danger or have ever experienced a negative event, will exhibit heightened physiological attention and stress when shown the visual shape of a snake compared to a frog or a flower.
They possess a built-in alarm system for a specific shape.
It is an evolved psychological mechanism. In our ancestral environment, failing to notice a venomous snake was a fatal error. Natural selection hardwired a rough visual template into our neurology.
However, the system is plastic. That innate preparedness requires environmental input nurture to determine its final expression.
Whether that baseline vigilance develops into a full-blown phobia or is suppressed because the child grows up handling pet snakes depends entirely on their individual experience.
Nature sets the parameter, nerd dials the knob.
But the relationship isn't a one-way street. Culture doesn't just sit on top of biology. Sometimes culture turns around and violently rewrites our DNA.
Let's talk about gene-culture coevolution, because for me, this is the ultimate realization of this deep dive. Let's look at lactase persistence.
It is the textbook example of how our cultural inventions have become the blind sculptor's hammer. Mammals are defined by producing milk for their young. To digest the lactose sugar in milk, infants produce an enzyme called lactase.
But historically, for all mammals, including ancestral humans, once the infant was weaned, the gene responsible for producing lactase simply shut off.
The body stopped making it because it was a waste of metabolic energy. Adult mammals are naturally lactose intolerant.
If an ancient human adult drank milk, they would get incredibly sick.
Precisely. But roughly 10,000 years ago, several human populations in Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa made a purely cultural innovation. They domesticated cattle and goats. They started dairy farming.
A completely arbitrary cultural choice.
But that cultural choice profoundly altered their environment. Suddenly there was a dense, nutrient-rich, constantly available food source: milk.
Now imagine a random genetic mutation occurs in an individual within this dairy farming culture. This mutation breaks the regulatory mechanism, causing the lactase gene to stay switched on into adulthood.
Suddenly, this person can drink milk without getting sick.
And in times of famine, when crops fail, the people who can digest milk from their herds survive. The people who cannot starve.
The cultural practice of dairy farming created an intense artificial biological selection pressure. The genetic variant for lactase persistence offered such a massive survival advantage that it swept rapidly through these populations.
Culture literally rewrote the human genome. We invented a farm, and the farm reached back and mutated our digestive tracts. It's a massive, continuous feedback loop.
Biological evolution creates the cognitive capacity for culture. Culture alters the environment. The altered environment creates new biological selection pressures, which further shape our genetics. You cannot fully separate human biology from human culture.
But this feedback loop, this ratchet effect, building global societies, none of it works without the ultimate tool of shared intentionality. We have to be able to transmit complex ideas. We have to talk about language.
Language is arguably the definitive human trait. It is a communication system unlike anything else in nature.
Other animals communicate, though. Vervet monkeys have specific alarm calls for leopards versus eagles.
But their calls are rigid and finite. Human language allows us to take a limited set of sounds and combine them using syntactic rules to generate an infinite number of completely novel meanings.
You can seamlessly understand a sentence that has never been spoken before in the history of the universe.
But tracing the evolution of language is notoriously frustrating for scientists, right? Because words don't leave fossils. We can't dig up an ancient noun.
It is deeply contested. We look to comparative biology. Chimpanzees possess impressive cognitive abilities, but they cannot acquire human syntax no matter how intensely they are trained.
So what changed in our lineage? While we lack behavioral fossils, we are beginning to find molecular clues. The most famous is the FOXP2 gene.
Tell us about FOXP2, because I know the media often mistakenly calls it the language gene.
It is definitely not a single language gene, but it is a vital piece of the puzzle. Researchers discovered a family in London where half the members suffered from a severe speech and language disorder.
They had profound difficulty coordinating the complex facial movements required for speech, and they struggled with grammar.
Geneticists tracked the disorder to a mutation in the FOXP2 gene.
So it's a regulatory gene involved in the physical motor control of speech.
Yes, and it is highly conserved across mammals. But the human version of FOXP2 has 2 specific amino acid changes compared to the chimpanzee version.
Astonishingly, if you look at songbirds, who have to learn complex vocalizations from their parents, disrupting their FOXP2 gene impairs their vocal learning.
It suggests this gene is part of a deep evolutionary toolkit for fine motor control and vocalization that was uniquely adapted in the human lineage to support speech.
Which proves language is a biological adaptation, not just a cultural invention like writing. And this connects directly to a struggle I think everyone listening can relate to.
Learning a second language.
Why is it that a 2-year-old child can absorb the incredibly complex rules of English or Mandarin almost effortlessly, but an adult can study Spanish for 5 years and still sound terrible?
That asymmetry was famously addressed by the linguist Noam Chomsky. Chomsky argued the nativist position. Children do not learn language using their general problem-solving intelligence.
They acquire it because the human brain possesses a specialized, evolved cognitive architecture dedicated specifically to processing language.
We are hardwired to extract grammar from the environment. Children acquire language rapidly, uniformly, and without explicit instruction. They figure out complex syntactic rules that even linguists struggle to formalize.
However, evolved biological systems often come with constraints, primarily critical periods.
The window of opportunity. Biology relies on efficiency. It is metabolically expensive to keep the brain completely plastic and unformed forever.
The neural architecture required to absorb phonetic sounds and grammatical structures remains highly flexible during early childhood, when the evolutionary imperative to acquire the local communication system is absolute.
But once the system is established, the biological window begins to close.
Which explains the phonological wall, why you can learn the vocabulary of a new language as an adult, but you almost never lose your native accent.
Exactly. The neural pathways for phonetic discrimination crystallize. It is not a failure of intelligence or effort on the part of the adult learner. It is an encounter with an evolved biological boundary.
So, practically speaking, if an adult listening to this wants to learn a new language, how can they use evolutionary theory to their advantage?
They need to abandon methods that work against our evolved architecture and embrace methods that work with it. If you try to learn a language purely analytically memorizing conjugation tables, treating it like a math equation, you are bypassing the cognitive systems designed for language.
You have to go back to Michael Tomasello's idea of shared intentionality.
Precisely. Humans evolved language to coordinate social action and share mental states. The motivational engine for language acquisition in a child is the deep biological desire to connect and be understood by another human being.
An adult learner should prioritize immersive, genuinely communicative environments. Focus on the raw intent to share meaning with someone else, rather than the perfection of the grammatical form.
When you trigger the social cooperative motivations of the human brain, you are utilizing the actual evolutionary hardware designed for the task.
You have to make it social. You can't just stare at a textbook. You have to trigger that primal desire to connect.
It is the most effective way to engage the system.
This has been an absolutely staggering journey. We started with a blind sculptor accidentally carving an eye out of a patch of skin.
We watched Mendel figure out the math of heredity with peas, while Darwin panicked over gemmules.
We analyzed the heavy, ridiculous cost of the peacock's tail. We saw how a simple choice to milk a cow permanently altered the DNA of human populations.
And we've seen how the exact same evolutionary pressure that taught us to fear snakes is the reason we struggle with a French accent.
The explanatory power of evolutionary theory is truly unrivaled. It is not merely a historical account of bones in the ground. It is an active, dynamic framework that illuminates the biological constraints, the cultural possibilities, and the fundamental nature of what it means to be human.
It's the operating system running under the surface of everything we do.
Mm.
And considering how culture and biology constantly co-evolve, it leaves us with a truly provocative question to ponder as we close.
If we accept that an ancient cultural shift like dairy farming exerted a selection pressure strong enough to rewrite the human genome, we have to ask ourselves about the cultural shifts happening right now.
We are radically changing the environment that the blind sculptor is working in. Look at our modern reality. We spend the vast majority of our waking hours bathed in artificial light, staring at two-dimensional screens.
We exist in a state of unprecedented physical sedentariness. We consume hypercaloric, heavily processed diets. We engage in rapid, globalized travel that homogenizes pathogen exposure.
What are those choices doing to us biologically? We are creating intense, novel selection pressures. And the question isn't whether evolution has stopped. It hasn't.
The question is, thousands of years from now, how will the biological blueprint of the human species reflect the bizarre, screen-lit culture we are building today? What are we blindly selecting for right now?
The sculptor is still swinging the hammer. The clay is still moving.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this massive deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you. Keep pulling at the threads of why we do what we do, and we will catch you in the next conversation.